The moment is just etched into history. Washington, D.C., January 2026.
Right.
President Donald Trump is standing before all the global media, and he declares this sweeping, almost total victory for the United States.
And his words were so clear.
We have liberated Venezuela. Maduro's dictatorship is over, and we are taking back the world's largest oil reserves.
It was a declaration of victory, but it was all predicated on this one assumption, that seizing the resource would somehow deliver stability.
When in reality,
It was the trigger for absolute global chaos.
and that's really the core of what we're tracking today. We're sort of skipping past the initial news cycle about the intervention itself, Operation Absolute Resolve, and we're going straight into the shockwaves.
The consequences.
Exactly. Our mission here is to understand how one single localized military action, which was supposed to secure a resource, just instantly spawned this massive refugee crisis, a Middle Eastern conflict,
Operation Eternal Shield.
and ultimately a multi-front global proxy war, a true shadow oil war involving Russia, China, and, well, even Japan.
And the motivation, as you said, it was completely undeniable. It was oil.
Of course.
Venezuela has an estimated 300 billion barrels of heavy crude. So the promise dangling in front of Washington was just immense.
So the idea was, as soon as the regime fell,
U.S. firms like Chevron, Exxon, they were just positioned to pour in tens of billions immediately. The aim was to more than triple the nation's previous peak production in, 3 years?
the calculation was just simple. American-aligned oil security.
That was the plan.
Okay, so let's unpack that initial victory in Caracas.
Yeah.
U.S. Delta Force executed the mission. They seized Maduro. The public pretext is, anti-drug and humanitarian intervention.
A successful tactical operation, but only in the narrowest possible sense.
Because the global intelligence community, they knew what was really going on.
Oh, instantly. They recognized the core objective was gaining control over that massive untapped energy supply.
But what became clear, and very quickly, was that the U.S. had only decapitated the government.
Not neutralize the state's military and, more importantly, its paramilitary apparatus. So that initial hope for a clean takeover it evaporated.
Because the hardcore Maduro loyalist militias, the infamous colectivos, they didn't surrender.
Not at all. They instantly transitioned into an insurgent force.
Yeah.
And they linked up with the seasoned Colombian left-wing guerrilla group, the ELN.
So the U.S. wasn't fighting disorganized state remnants. They were suddenly facing an experienced, coordinated...
A cross-border guerrilla force. And the terrain played perfectly into their hands.
The Venezuelan rainforest.
Precisely. The vast, dense rainforest became the defining feature of the conflict. It wasn't about holding cities anymore. It was about protecting pipelines and supply routes.
Which became almost impossible.
Almost. The insurgency immediately focused on classic guerrilla warfare. So you see bomb attacks specifically targeting the oil infrastructure the U.S. was there to secure.
And at the same time, just this constant low-level attrition sniping U.S. patrols.
And the supply chain for this insurgency, well, that was already well established.
Right, which is a crucial detail.
It is. Their ability to sustain the fight depended entirely on weapons and cash. And these were smuggled in using the established cartel drug routes that crisscrossed the Venezuelan-Colombian border.
So the criminal economy basically became the logistical backbone of the political resistance.
Exactly.
The initial deployment was pretty robust, about 15,000 U.S. troops. But how quickly did the U.S. realize this wasn't a quick surgical intervention?
Almost immediately. The daily casualties and the constant sabotage, they quickly showed the limitations of conventional forces in that kind of terrain.
A quagmire.
A total military quagmire. The hit-and-run strategy drew these immediate and, inevitable parallels to Vietnam.
And that feeling wasn't just limited to the troops on the ground, was it? We saw it bubble up in the intelligence world very quickly.
That's right. As the decision was made to increase troop numbers just to stem the bleeding, former CIA analyst Larry Johnson issued this very public, very stark analysis.
The one that resonated across Washington.
He just said, this is a quagmire. And at that point, the initial strategic goal of rapidly increasing oil flow became entirely secondary to just containing the insurgency.
The mission changed.
The commitment was now endless.
So while the military situation is bogging down, the humanitarian crisis just explodes. It was a 1-2 punch that rocked the entire global community.
The scope is devastating. Before the intervention, Venezuela already had one of the world's largest refugee crises. We're talking about roughly 7 million people displaced.
And the military conflict just triggers a mass exodus on top of that.
Adding millions more almost overnight.
And that puts immense immediate pressure on the neighbors Colombia and Brazil, who were, well, they were already struggling with the existing flow.
They were completely overwhelmed. The sources detail how their social services, their border patrol, they just disintegrated under the sheer volume.
And for those trying to get further north, the most dangerous route, the Darien Gap.
It's on a massive, immediate surge.
So for you listening, if you're not familiar with the Darien Gap, what did that actually mean? Why is it so significant?
Well, it's more than just a rough patch of land. The Darien Gap is a 66-mile stretch of roadless, extremely dense jungle, swamp, and mountains.
Separating Colombia and Panama.
Right. It's infested with dangerous wildlife, and critically, it's controlled by paramilitary and organized crime groups who prey on migrants.
So a surge meant that hundreds of thousands of people,
including families, were suddenly subjecting themselves to this extreme risk. It turned a regional tragedy into a humanitarian disaster right on the U.S. doorstep.
which brings us to the domestic fallout in the U.S. The intervention was supposed to secure resources, but the result was instability right at home.
A profound domestic crisis. The humanitarian flow hitting the U.S. southern border was just unprecedented. Texas immigration camps were overwhelmed instantly.
Creating chaos and massive logistical costs.
And the border wall, which was meant to be the final barrier, it failed utterly to stem a flow that was driven by existential fear and violence.
A wall might stop individuals, but it can't stop millions of people fleeing a war zone.
Exactly. The need for shelter, for processing, for long-term aid for these millions created this immense, unexpected economic burden.
And that quickly became a political flashpoint across the country.
And beyond the logistics, there was a significant political backlash. Widespread anti-war protests erupted in U.S. cities.
But the most pointed criticism came from the community the U.S. claimed to be championing.
The Miami Venezuelan exile community, they watched this intervention destroy their home and create an even deeper refugee crisis.
Which led to that highly publicized question, is this liberation?
They were pointing out that the immediate outcome for their people was suffering, not freedom.
So that's the Venezuelan quagmire and the human cost.
Yeah.
But this whole story, it doesn't stay confined to the Caribbean.
No.
The U.S. reliance on those future Venezuelan reserves, it created a false sense of security that just metastasized into a crisis on the other side of the world.
That false sense of security is the hinge point of the entire crisis. The perception that the U.S. now had insurance with Venezuelan oil.
Even if it was heavy crude that needed refining.
It allowed policymakers in Washington and Tel Aviv to execute a move that had been on the drawing board for years, striking Iran's nuclear program.
Tell us about that escalation.
Well, at the specific request of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, the U.S. launched Operation Eternal Shield. It was a massive campaign of precision bombings targeting key Iranian nuclear facilities.
And the belief was that even if Tehran retaliated,
the world could weather the oil price spike because Venezuelan supply would eventually mitigate the long-term pain.
and the speed of the retaliation proved that calculation to be tragically wrong.
Catastrophically wrong. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, did exactly what they had always threatened to do.
They sealed off the Strait of Hormuz.
That single passage handles 20% of the world's oil transport. It's the ultimate choke point.
And they used a combination of missiles,
Yeah.
drones,
Missiles, drone swarms, and extensive mine laying. They rendered the strait impassable for commercial tankers within 48 hours.
So this wasn't a minor disruption. This was severing a major artery for global trade. What happened to the energy market?
It was a global economic heart attack. Oil prices, which were already high at near $100 a barrel, they didn't just climb.
They leaped.
They executed a vertical leap. They hit $200 almost instantly, and then in the next few hours, they breached $300 a barrel.
The markets went into total panic.
Total panic. Traders realized the closure wasn't temporary, and supply chains dependent on stable pricing just failed.
And what did that look like for people outside the oil industry?
Immediate, visible economic pain globally. We saw gasoline queues forming across Western nations, signaling impending shortages.
But more critically,
Industrial manufacturing was decimated. Factories that run on thin margins and just-in-time supply chains began shutting down immediately due to the energy shock.
and the sources specifically focus on Germany.
Yes. Germany's massive automobile industry, the backbone of the export economy, was perhaps the hardest hit.
Dependent on affordable energy.
Consistent, affordable energy and complex global supply lines. The spike and the shortage brought major production lines to a standstill,
forcing the Schultz regime to declare a national energy crisis.
which threatened recession across the entire European Union. So the goal of securing oil in Venezuela led directly to industrial shutdown in Europe.
And this crisis drew in a major and formerly reticent U.S. ally, Japan.
Japan found itself in an absolutely impossible position. 90% of their crude imports passed through the Strait of Hormuz.
So then the strait closed.
They faced national energy collapse. The sources describe the immediate effect. Dark streetlights in Tokyo. That's how severe the shortage was. Prime Minister Kishida was under enormous pressure.
And he made a historic decision.
He did. Under a U.S. request, and citing the immediate need to secure their own supply lines, Kishida dispatched the Japan Self-Defense Forces, the JMSDF, specifically to Hormuz for minesweeping and intelligence-gathering missions. This was a watershed moment in post-war Japanese policy.
For decades, they'd just provided financial support.
Exactly, sending money. Now, they were deploying military assets into a recognized combat zone. The energy crisis had fundamentally altered their geopolitical identity. They were actively involved in the war.
So we have the U.S. military overstretched in the Venezuelan jungle, a global economy teetering on the brink because of Hormuz.
And this is the moment China and Russia step in.
This is where the shadow oil war truly becomes a global confrontation.
You see two distinct yet coordinated strategies emerge from the major U.S. rivals. China, for its part, avoided deploying its own troops into that meat grinder.
Right, but they were active facilitators.
Precisely. The Chinese Foreign Ministry condemned the U.S. action as a blatant sovereignty violation, which gave the resistance diplomatic legitimacy.
But internally, they were conflicted.
Deeply. Their own economy was hurting badly from the unstable oil supply caused by the Hormuz blockage. So while they offered public condemnation, they funneled significant arms and money to the Venezuelan guerrillas.
Using Russia as the intermediary.
Yes. They wanted the U.S. bogged down, but they needed oil flowing eventually.
Russia, on the other hand, saw this not as a risk, but as a pure, massive strategic opportunity.
Financial windfall, unlike anything they could have anticipated. President Putin immediately framed the conflict in Venezuela as a critical anti-American front.
And the price of oil jumping to $300 a barrel.
It created a massive sudden surge in Russia's export revenue. The sources are explicit about this. This shock effectively doubled the available funding for their ongoing war effort in Ukraine.
So the U.S. intervention, meant to secure American energy interests, had inadvertently financed its chief European adversary.
And Russia's support for the collectivos was extremely practical and kinetic.
It moved from abstract aid to direct operational support.
It did. We know Russia had previously supplied modern hardware systems like the S-300 and Taurus-1 air defenses, but those were neutralized by the initial U.S. airstrikes.
So their new strategy was different.
Focused entirely on enhancing the insurgency's lethality?
What were the specifics of that support?
They moved away from high-tech defenses and focused on infantry warfare. They began secretly transporting critical gear, large shipments of AK-47s, RPG-7 rocket launchers, and critically advanced night vision devices.
And these weapons were routed
Along a supply corridor running through friendly nations like Cuba and Nicaragua. But perhaps the most impactful element was the human capital.
Russian military advisors.
Actively embedded, training the collectivos' militia in tactical warfare, turning them into a much more disciplined and effective fighting force against U.S. patrols.
So the incredible irony stands. The U.S. launched an intervention to secure oil, and in doing so, created a financial lifeline for Russia, destabilized the Middle East, and brought allies like Germany and Japan to the brink.
That is the synthesis of this shadow oil war. A localized intervention for resource control that metastasized into a global economic and military crisis.
And it immediately strengthened U.S. rivals and created fragility across the entire Western alliance.
That's it.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this deep dive? We started with that triumphant declaration of victory in Washington. We tracked that intervention through a grueling jungle quagmire, watched it ignite a Middle Eastern conflict,
Operation Eternal Shield.
and saw it establish these new interconnected war fronts, from the Caribbean all the way to the Persian Gulf.
The overarching narrative is that the desperate desire to control petroleum prices had orchestrated this interconnected global conflict. It was defining the new strategic landscape.
Just revisit those disparate images.
U.S. helicopters burning in the Venezuelan jungle, the massive surge of refugees overwhelming the Darien Gap, and the Japan Self-Defense Forces ships tensely monitoring the Straits of Hormuz thousands of miles from home.
Everyone involved recognized what this had become.
An endless war. And it was fundamentally driven by that initial decision to secure a resource that wasn't even flowing yet.
The profound lesson here is just the speed with which President Trump's initial confident declaration of victory vanished from public memory.
It was completely superseded by this ongoing interconnected global instability.
The stated goal was to secure American oil and ensure energy stability, but the final devastating result was geopolitical chaos that touched every single continent.
And that leaves us with this final provocative thought for you to consider. How much did the perception of a massive future U.S. energy guarantee those 300 billion barrels blind policymakers to the immediate inevitable risks of retaliation that the rest of the world was clearly ready to take? If the security guarantee wasn't real yet, what does relying on the promise of future resources tell us about how we justify conflict in the present?